The air in the saloon was a thick, breathing thing, heavy with the stench of stale whiskey, sweat, and the bitter smoke of cheap cigars. It clung to the rough-hewn timbers of the walls and settled like a shroud over Tiva. She knelt on the floorboards, the splintered wood digging into her knees, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floor, refusing to meet the leering eyes that stripped her of everything but her shame. The world had shrunk to this foul-smelling room, to the guttural laughter of the men who had gambled her away like a worn-out saddle. Her freedom, her name, her very being. All had been reduced to a losing hand of cards, laid bare on a stained table. The man who had lost her, a trapper named Beau with cruel, small eyes, shoved the table away with a curse. The man who had once sat opposite, a silhouette against the grimy window. He had been silent throughout the game, his face a landscape of sun-scorched leather and shadow, revealing nothing. He hadn't looked at her once, not even when the final card was played. This silence was more terrifying than Beau's open malice. It was a void, an unknown darkness into which she was about to be cast. She felt the vibration through the floor as he pushed his chair back and rose. He was tall, his frame lean but broad, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. A ripple of fear, cold and sharp, traced its way up her spine. She braced for a rough hand, a command, the familiar brutality she had come to expect from men like these. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting. The silence in the room stretched, taut and suffocating. "Well, Cobb," Beau sneered, his voice slick with resentment. "You won the pot. Collect your winnings." The man, Cobb, finally moved. He walked around the table, his steps measured and heavy. He stopped not in front of her, but beside her. He looked down, and for the first time his eyes met hers. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, gray and deep and unreadable. There was no triumph in them, no lust. There was only a profound weariness, a hollowness that seemed to echo her own. He said nothing to her. He addressed the room. "The deal is done." His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry riverbed. He tossed a few extra coins onto the table, a finality in the clatter they made. He then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the door. It was not a command given to a dog, but an indication, a direction. Tiva remained frozen, her muscles locked by a terror that was part a memory of past cruelties and part a dread of future ones. He did not touch her. He simply turned and walked towards the exit, the swing doors groaning open to reveal a slice of the dying, blood-orange light of dusk. He did not look back to see if she was following. He left the choice, a sliver of agency in a moment where she had none, hanging in the foul air behind him. Slowly, pushing against the weight of 100 gazes, Tiva rose to her feet. Her dignity was a tattered thing, but it was all she had left. She would not be dragged. She would walk. She followed the silent man out into the biting wind of the plains, leaving the suffocating warmth of the saloon for the vast, cold indifference of the land. The walk was a silent ordeal across a landscape that offered no comfort. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tore at her thin tunic, a constant, abrasive reminder of her vulnerability. Cobb walked several paces ahead, his long strides eating up the dry, cracked earth. He never looked back, his posture unchanging, a solitary figure moving against the endless horizon. Tiva's mind raced, a frantic animal caught in a snare. Every shadow cast by a yucca plant seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered taunt. She thought of her people, of the warmth of the cook-fires and the familiar cadence of her language. It felt like a memory from another life, a world she had been violently torn from. This man, this silent stranger, was now her entire world, a world comprised of a barren landscape and a future she could not bear to imagine. His hut, when they finally reached it, was little more than a sod and timber dugout built into the side of a low hill, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was a place of profound loneliness. Smoke curled weakly from a stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stepped inside, leaving it open for her. The interior was sparse but surprisingly clean. A single cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-spun blanket folded neatly upon it. A stone hearth dominated the opposite wall, its embers glowing with a faint, welcoming warmth. There was a small, sturdy table with one chair. It was a space built for one, its solitude now broken. Cobb moved with an economy of motion born of long practice. He stoked the fire, adding a few pieces of wood from a neat pile by the hearth. The flames caught, licking at the dry timber, casting flickering shadows that danced across the packed earth walls. He took a tin plate from a shelf, filled it with jerky and a piece of hard bread, and set it on the table. Then he moved to the far corner, turning his back to her as he checked the lashings on his saddle. He had offered her the only chair, the only plate of food. He had not spoken a single word. Tiva stood just inside the doorway, the cold wind at her back and the uncertain warmth of the fire before her. She did not understand this man. There was no gloating, no roughness. His actions were practical, detached. He treated her not as a prize, but as a presence. An inconvenient fact he was dealing with in the only way he knew how. Her pride warred with the gnawing hunger in her belly. To accept his food felt like submission, yet to refuse it was to invite weakness. After a long moment, her survival instinct won. She moved to the table, her legs stiff, and sat in the chair. She ate slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off his back. When she was finished, he still had not moved. He seemed content to wait out her fear, to let the silence and the simple offering of sustenance speak for him. Night fell completely, sealing them in the small, fire-lit space. He eventually laid out a spare horsehide on the floor, a good distance from both the hearth and his own cot. It was a clear, unspoken designation of her space. He then lay down on his cot, pulling the blanket up to his shoulder, and faced the wall. The fire crackled, the wind moaned outside, and in the small hut, two solitary souls existed in a silence as vast and profound as the plains themselves. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silence and observation. Tiva woke each morning to find Cobb already gone, a small portion of food left for her by the cooling embers of the fire. She watched him from the doorway of the hut as he went about his solitary chores. He moved with a quiet competence, mending a fence line that seemed to guard nothing from nothing, tending to his solitary, aging horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was a man deeply embedded in his own loneliness, comfortable in it. He never looked at her with possession, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a part of the landscape he had not yet reconciled himself with. Tiva's fear slowly began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She began to find her own routines. She swept the hard-packed floor with a makeshift broom of prairie grass. She tidied the few provisions on the shelves. These small acts were not for him, but for herself. They were an assertion of order in a life that had been thrown into chaos. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the northwest, a bruised purple mass that swallowed the sun and plunged the plains into a premature twilight. The wind shrieked, and rain began to fall in hard, driving sheets. Cobb worked quickly, securing a loose shutter, checking the sod roof for weak spots. The hut groaned under the assault of the storm. Tiva found herself holding her breath, the fury of the weather a reflection of the turmoil she'd felt for so long. Cobb came back inside, soaked and dripping, his face grim. He threw more wood on the fire, and the flames roared in defiance of the wind howling down the chimney. He glanced at her, huddled near the hearth, and saw she was shivering. Without a word, he took the blanket from his own cot and held it out to her. Tiva hesitated, her eyes locked on his. In his gaze, she saw not pity, but a simple, straightforward acknowledgement of her cold. It was the first gesture that felt like a connection, a bridge across the chasm of silence between them. She took the blanket, its rough wool warm and smelling faintly of wood smoke and him. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the simple act a shield against both the cold and her own lingering fear. They sat through the storm, he on his stool mending a piece of tack, she on the floor by the fire. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the violent symphony of the storm outside. In that shared space, Hemmed in by the tempest, something shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet, shared endurance. She was still a captive, her future uncertain, but she was no longer just an object. In the shelter of the hut, amidst the rage of the storm, she was a person who was cold, and a man had given her his blanket. It was a start. The morning broke clear and cold, the air washed clean by the storm. A fragile peace had settled over the land and, Tiva felt, within the small hut. Cobb was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar, almost comforting sound. Tiva was kneading a small bit of dough for bread when a change in that rhythm made her look up. The chopping had stopped. A deep, unnatural silence fell over the plains. A prickle of unease ran down her arms. She moved to the doorway and looked out. Her breath caught in her throat. Arranged in a silent, menacing semicircle around the hut were a dozen warriors from her tribe. They sat upon their horses, their faces grim, painted for battle. At their head was her brother, Kono, his expression a mask of fury and grief. They had found her. They saw the hut, the white man's dwelling, and they saw her standing in the doorway. Their gazes were hard, full of accusation. In their eyes, she was defiled, her honor lost. Cobb stood by the woodpile, the axe still in his hand. He slowly, deliberately set it down. He raised his hands, showing they were empty, and stood his ground. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply stood and waited, a lone figure against an overwhelming force. Kono's voice cut through the air, sharp and guttural in their shared tongue. "Sister, step away from that man. We have come to bring you home and to exact the price for your shame. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They saw only what they expected to see. They did not see the quiet respect, the blanket offered during the storm, the space he had given her. They saw a captor and his prize. In that moment, Tiva faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could run to the safety of her brother's arms, confirming their beliefs, and in doing so, condemn Cobb to a brutal death. Or she could stand for the strange, complicated truth of her situation. She took a breath, the cold air searing her lungs, and she made her choice. She walked out of the hut, her steps measured and firm, and stood not behind Cobb, but beside him. She faced her brother, her chin held high. "Kono," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had ever heard it. It did not tremble. "There is no shame here," a murmur ran through the line of warriors. Kono's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from her to Cobb, and back again. "He took you," he spat. "No," Tiva said, the word a stone dropping into a still pond. "He won a foolish wager from a cruel man. He brought me to his home. He has shared his fire and his food. He has not touched me. He has shown me no dishonor." The silence that followed was absolute. Kono stared at her, searching her face for a lie, for the flicker of fear that would betray her words. He found none. He saw only the woman she was becoming, not the lost girl he had come to rescue. He saw a strength in her eyes he did not recognize. Cobb remained perfectly still beside her, a silent testament to her words. He did not understand their language, but he understood the stand she was taking. He had given her a blanket against the cold, and now she was giving him his life. Kono struggled, his warrior's pride battling the truth he saw in his sister's unwavering gaze. Finally, with a sharp, frustrated cry, he wheeled his horse around. He gave one last, hard look at Tiva, a look of confusion and reluctant acceptance. Without another word, he led his warriors away, their forms receding into the vastness of the prairie until they were gone. Tiva and Cobb were left alone in the sudden, ringing silence, the ground between them forever changed. They had faced death together and survived.